Well, thank you, Mark. It's great to be back with the ALL group and talk about what has become one of my favorite subjects, Wendell Berry. Those who've been in these sessions before with me know, but the new ones should also know, I enjoy give and take all the way through the program. And so either you can just turn your mic on and interject something, a question or a comment as we go along. Or Mark, what about, do you want to monitor the chat function as we go along? If somebody wants to pose a comment or a question that way, if you'll just bring my attention to it. How does that sound?
I would be glad to do that.
That's great. Well, since moving to Kentucky about 2.5 years ago, it's been my pleasure to get to know the state, which turned out to be beautiful and many interesting features of the landscapes, places to visit, but also to read about well-known Kentuckians. And some of the subjects I've read about are Daniel Boone, who opened up Kentucky really more than anybody else to settlement. Kentucky used to be part of Virginia, and it attained statehood in 1792. And there's a famous painting of Daniel Boone leading settlers through the Cumberland Gap. And I've actually visited the National Historic Site and stood right where that gap was, where the settlers from the eastern states poured into Kentucky in the late 1700s. Also, Henry Clay, the great compromiser leading up to the Civil War, tried to run for president 4 times and never got there. Let's see, who else? John Marshall Harlan. He was the lone dissenting vote in Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1890s that upheld the segregation laws that had become the norm in the Deep South. But he was a dissenter, and then he was quoted a lot as Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, and we began to see the Supreme Court supporting integration rather than segregation. So great Kentuckians, and then Wendell Berry, a name that was familiar with me, but I just was in the local public library here, and name rang a bell, and Berry's written about 50 books. I guess I've read now by about half of them, and so hope to spark the interest. And Don's already said he's a Wendell Berry reader, and so I hope some of you either are motivated to become readers of his stuff. Agrarian prophet, the word prophet has only secondarily a meaning about prophesying the future or foretelling the future. It's primarily a word for somebody who's going to let you have it, both barrels, about all of your iniquity and your sin and all the stuff you're messing up and screwing up, and call you to repentance and turn your life around and come away from your evil ways. And there's going to be a lot of doom and torment if you don't. Maybe we're already in that. So that's the primary meaning behind attaching prophet to Wendell Berry. And I'd say don't read his stuff unless you want to be blasted pretty hard about the way that most Americans live. But there's certainly a role for somebody to call attention to the stuff that we should consider changing about our normal way of life, what it's become. Let's see, now I'm trying to go to the next slide. Thomas Jefferson, this quotation is the reason why Jefferson has the reputation for supporting the yeoman farmer, the small farmer ideal. As few as possible shall be without a little portion of land. The small landholders, the most precious part of the state. Jeffersonian democracy was a very decentralized and distributed concept instead of the concentrations of power among the wealthy and the powerful. Let's distribute the resources of the country in a lot of little small parcels. I think it's Jefferson's idea that led to the Homestead Act, 160 acres that you could claim. I believe if that legislation was passed during Abraham Lincoln's administration. And so by the late 1800s, there were just thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands small farms all around the country that people lived on, and that's where they made a little bit of cash, but mostly were subsistence farmers. And that's kind of the ideal that you see projected by Berry. It's very much part of his own life, and something that is very regrettably, in his view, gone by the wayside way too much. Outline for my program, a little bit about his life, and then poetry, fiction, and criticism, three genres in which he has excelled. And the criticism, there's some literary criticism. He's got some great literary criticism, especially about Shakespeare and Lear and As You Like It, but mostly criticism of agriculture as it's come to be done, strip mining, and industrialization, other social characteristics that he thinks are definitely on the wrong track. So a little bit about his life. In 1934, born in Henry County, which is one county away from the Ohio River, and that's, of course, the northern boundary of Kentucky. Separates and the southern boundaries of states like Ohio and Indiana. The Kentucky River flows through Henry County and then goes into the Ohio River as a tributary. Henry County is about half the size of Alpena County, so population about 15,000. The town where he was born, I don't remember the exact town, but the town that he lives in now, has lived in since 1964 or 5, is called Port Royal. And its census, the last census was 79 people. It's an unincorporated hamlet. And that would make it about 1/3 the size of Posen, if you want to make a comparison there. It's Pat and I actually drove out there. We were on another trip to see an art exhibit, and I talked Condor into going up to see Port Royal, and I ended up owing her 1 or 2 big time after that. A lot of travel over little country roads, but we got to see the cemetery where his parents and many of his forebears are buried. And he grew up on a family farm. His father, although he practiced law, he considered himself to be a farmer first and practicing law on the side. They grew tobacco. And I'm in the middle of reading this book called Burley, which is the type of tobacco that's mostly grown. 90% of the tobacco in Kentucky is burley tobacco. I think it's the second largest tobacco growing state behind North Carolina now. But it's been very interesting to me to see, to read about how tobacco was grown. Of course, tobacco was much more in the mainstream of agriculture 100 years ago than it was now. Went to University of Kentucky, where he married his wife, met his wife there, and they've been married, I think, about 65 years now. And then after his master's degree, went to a very prestigious creative writing program at Stanford University. Some of his classmates were Larry McMurtry, a Texas novelist, and Ken Kesey, who was part of the beat scene in San Francisco. I think Ken Kesey's book is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So he was in really good company there. There he is with his wife. and looking very happy. And everything I've read about them, they really have had a long and happy marriage. So it's kind of a sweet picture of the two of them. After the Stanford program, he got a Guggenheim Fellowship to travel a couple of years, Italy and France, and he talks about that experience. Mostly is focused on how farming was done, especially in southern France, and comparing it to the farming he grew up with in Kentucky. Got a job teaching English at NYU, lived in Greenwich Village, the center in the early 60s. So a lot of poetic and other artistic endeavor. He had arrived and made the scene big time there, and he was where it was thought most poets wanted to be for the rest of their life. How could you want to leave a place like that? Published his first book of poetry in '64, and by that time had a good friendship with Gary Snyder, who handles the term beat poet kind of gingerly, keeps the distance from him, but they formed a friendship. And Gary Snyder was also somebody who went out in California to a rural property and homesteaded there. So a lot of similarities between the way of life that the two of them chose. Creative writing at University of Kentucky. He actually was there, lived in Lexington, where UK is, only for a year. But as time went on, he began to be more and more aroused against the coal industry, especially strip mining. And he had his papers there for a while in the library, but he withdrew them as a part of his protest against what was being done to the land by the coal companies. There he is in his home in Port Royal. He has a little cabin or studio, I guess, with lots of windows, as you can see. He's about 30 years old there. Feet up on the desk, looks like a legal pad, does all his writing, longhand, and then his wife does a lot of the typing for him. But wonderful place to look out the window, and you can see it's a kind of setting where you could be very productive. In 1965, left New York. When he announced that he was leaving at NYU, some of the senior faculty members came and tried to talk to him about being crazy to do that. And that's a good way to commit intellectual suicide and professional suicide. You're right here. You're a tenured professor at NYU, right in the thick of where all the poetic stuff is going on. Why would you go back to Kentucky? I guess you could say Berry showed him a thing or two. When he got a 12-acre homestead there, eventually expanded it to 117, and he started becoming known as a protester. Nothing violent, but his targets of his protests were strip mining. A lot of that both in Western Kentucky. I've actually been to Muhlenberg County, where the John Prine song is about how, sorry, my son, you're too late in asking that Mr. Peabody's coal train has hauled it away, the mountain that used to be there, where Paradise lay. I've actually been to Paradise in Muhlenberg County, and there's a big coal mining operation there. Also Eastern Kentucky and Appalachia. He became an opponent of nuclear power, the war in Iraq, and also other causes. And a very interesting story about his occupancy. It's really a home invasion, if you want to call it that. The governor's mansion in 2011. Let's see, he's in his late 70s then, with other protesters. I think this was against strip mining. Now, I have never read that he and his fellow protesters were armed and nobody died, but in some respects, it resembles the January 6th assault by the mob on the U.S. Capitol. They marched in there and took over a reception room without permission and set up their protest, started making noise in there, bringing the media in. But I saw an interview, a really funny interview with him about how this all worked out. He said, well, guess what? We got into the governor's mansion and set up our protest there, and he outsmarted us. And how did he outsmart the governor? It was Steve Bashir. Well, he came down to the reception room where we were camped out, and instead of calling in the law enforcement with all their riot gear and their shields and their batons and running us off, he graciously welcomed us and told us it was fine to stay as long as we want to. He made arrangements for the media to come in, cover the protests, and for the people bringing food to them and supporting them in various other ways. Just come on in. And so they were, Wendell talks about on the way in there, somebody asked him, Wendell, do you want to go to jail? And he says, no, hell no, I want to be willing to go to jail, but not actually go there. So I thought that was a really great line. And the governor really did outsmart him. He took they expected to be martyrs, and he didn't let them do that. They finally got an agreement out of him to go visit the strip mines, and I don't know whether the governor actually did that, but you can maybe think about how the January 6th uprising might have come out different if Nancy Pelosi and Mike Pence had acted like that Kentucky governor. Come on in, this is your place, and do your thing. Anyway, he began to receive a lot of honors later on in his life, as well as earlier in his life, the fellowships that he got. Library of America, I've read through most of the first of 4 volumes of his work. There he is receiving the National Humanities Medal from Barack Obama. The amazing thing to me about honors and awards is that he has not won a Pulitzer Prize. I'm kind of wondering why not. He certainly has the stature, in my opinion, to have earned one in maybe more than one of the genres where those prizes are offered. And there's my favorite picture of him. He's out in a field. I can't even identify what that crop is. Maybe wheat. Yeah, it looks kind of like wheat, but he's got a big smile on his face and a straw hat on, and he's right where he wants to be, being a farmer. Well, let me pause there. Any comment before we go into a bit of his poetry? Questions? All right, let's get into some poetry. And it's a big no-no to read your slides if you're using PowerPoint, but poetry is different. It's meant to be heard. And so I'm going to read some of these poems because I love how they sound, and they're meant to be appreciated for not just words on the page, but how they sound. So Daniel Boone, I approach my death, descend toward the last fact. It is not clear to me, as it once seemed when I hunted in the new lands alone. I could foresee the skeleton hiding with its wound after the fear and flesh were gone. Now it may come as a part of sleep. My great-grandfather's slave. Deep in the back ways of my mind, I see them going in the long days over the same fields I have gone long days over. I am owned by the blood of all of them who were ever owned by my blood. We cannot be free of each other. That's just an amazing sentence. So next to the last one, I am owned by the blood of all of them who ever were owned by my blood. Wow. What a line. And there he is in the cemetery at Port Royal with his great-grandfather. You go to that cemetery and you immediately notice this stone figure, life-size, and there he is with his great-grandson who wrote a poem about him. The dream. I dream an inescapable dream in which I take from the country the bridges and roads, the fences, the strung wires, ourselves, all we have built and dug and hollowed out, our flocks and herds, our droves of machines. I restore then the wide branching trees. Against the war in Vietnam, believe the officials who see without doubt that peace is assured by war, freedom by oppression. Believe or die. We see the American freedom defended with lies, and the lies defended with blood. The vision of Jefferson served by the agony of children, women cowering in holes. Going back to the vision of Jefferson. This is about my favorite. We are the last hope of the world, for we have no excuses, nobody to blame but ourselves. Who is going to sit at our feet and listen while we bewail our historical sufferings? Who will ever believe that we also have wept in the night and with repressed longing to become our real selves? Nobody, and that is good. Isn't that wonderful? Now, this is one of about a dozen Mad Farmer poems, and it's a persona he takes on. Mad, of course, means both angry and crazy. So, friends, every day do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing, take all that you have and be poor. Love somebody who does not deserve it. Denounce the government and embrace the flag. Hope to live in that free republic for which it stands. Give your approval to all you cannot understand. Praise ignorance, for what man has not encountered, he has not destroyed. And I love this one too. Oh, when the world's at peace and every man is free, then I will go down unto my love. Oh, and I may go down several times before that. So there's another mad farmer. That's Leo Tolstoy. And Tolstoy was born a count in nobility, wealth. He was a bloodthirsty member of the Russian cavalry as a young man, riotous living, drinking, partying. And then he had a big turnaround in his 50s. And he turned his back on his wealth. He tried to give it all away. His wife wouldn't let him. Instead of the finery, he put on the garb of the peasants, and you see him there. And he worked in the fields all day long with the peasants. He said, I used to have 14, 16 hours a day just to do writing. And after I started working in the fields, I got much more writing done in the 4 to 6 hours that remained in the day. And then I also got to lie down and sleep the sleep of the just, because I had earned it with both my physical labor and my mental labor. And my conscience was much clearer. He also became a pacifist. He wrote a book called The Kingdom of God is Within You, in which he interprets quite literally the teachings of Jesus about love your enemies and turn the other cheek. He says we should let the evildoers do what they're going to do, but we should not descend to their level by opposing them with armies or law enforcement organizations. And so that's Berry's not a complete pacifist. He does grudgingly allow maybe if a foreign country invades us, we should defend ourselves. But he comes pretty darn close. He also says the Civil War had a good outcome of eliminating slavery, but it could have been done without the war, with an exercise of what he calls leniency, give and take, understanding instead of the extremists taking over the centrist position, of which there were quite a few. Last poem. They lived long and were faithful to the good in each other. They suffered as their faith required. Now their union is consummate in earth, and the earth is their communion. They enter the serene gravity of the rain, the hill's passage to the sea after long striving, perfect ease. Little taste of the poetry now. I'll pause again, see if there are any comments.
I very much enjoyed reading those through. Thank you for reading your slides.
Occasionally, it's the right thing to do. You're welcome. Okay, now the key to his fiction is understanding what he calls the membership. And these are family around Port William. He calls it Port William, but it's modeled very much after Port Royal, where he lives. And there's such a strong connection among these families. You hear about barn raisings among the Amish. He admires the Amish very much, and all the cooperation you have in Amish communities is very much like that. In what he remembers growing up in and hearing about in rural Kentucky, especially the early part of the 20th century. He pretty much the turning point for him was 1950 when tractors came in. Before then, it was horses and mules, and the little farms were maybe 80, 100 acres. They grew some crops that they sold, mostly tobacco. They grew enough corn to feed their livestock. They had chickens for meat and for eggs, hogs for meat. They had land, they had sheep, and then in the springtime, when it was still cold, they brought the ewes that were about to deliver into the barns and heated the barns and helped the ewes through the process of birthing the lambs, making sure that the lambs were okay and they were nursing with the ewes. And then eventually lambs were marketed. In the third bullet point in the South, the main meal is dinner, and it's a noon meal. And so the workers in the field, mostly men, but not completely, came in, and they all had a good social time, eating together and resting a bit, back to work. And the youngsters were brought up to work on the farms, doing whatever they could as soon as they could, and growing into what was expected for them to take over the farms when their elders were fading away. And here you see the family tree for Port William. families in Berry's fiction, the Beechams, the Faulkners, the Coulters, the Wheelers, and all the interconnections among these people that appear and reappear multiple times in different works of his fiction. So sometimes it's hard to keep track of characters in just about every work of fiction. With Wendell Berry, you get this array of who the characters are, who they're related to. You probably can't see the individual names so much, but anyway, and there's the map, like Faulkner has. Well, I'll show you Faulkner's map of his own mythic county, but this is Port William, modeled after Port Royal. The river, of course, is the Kentucky River, and you can, I don't know if you can make out, but the inscriptions there are where the different farms are of the people, the families that you just saw the family trees for. So you can kind of see, as you read through his fiction, you can see, okay, well, this is over at this farm and that's over there, and get an idea of what's going on, a better idea. This is William Faulkner's famous similar map. He says, surveyed and mapped for this volume by William Faulkner. And he makes up this Yakdapatawata County in this town Jefferson, which is very much like where he lived in Mississippi. And you see some of the names of the novels there and the characters there and what happened in some of them. Wendell Berry is like Faulkner in this way and lots of other ways, although he's much easier to read. I mean, in Berry, you have a long sentence going on 4 or 5 lines. In Faulkner, you've got sentences going on for pages and pages, and he plays all kinds of, Faulkner does all kinds of tricks on the reader that just make it really hard to follow. And mercifully, Berry does that only with a light touch. He's not a lot more gracious to the reader than Faulkner was, and every bit as meaningful in my opinion. Some of the characters, Wheeler Catlett, very much modeled after Berry's father. Again, the farmer who practices law, not the lawyer who farms, and he goes out there after work and makes his connection to the members. And he's also in his law practice, does what he can to try to make sure that the right people end up with inheriting or having a good opportunity to buy the farms that he thinks they should have and that the membership thinks that they should have. So to preserve that continuity, that social continuity, let's do what we can to resist outsiders coming in. The doctor who practices in Louisville who wants a place to come out in the country, or the land developer who thinks that you can just come in there and destroy the barns and the houses and put a housing development up in there. Let's make sure the right people get the land as much as we can. Very much like Berry's own father. Uncle Peach, well, he's one of several characters in Berry's work who has a pretty serious alcohol problem, and he'll work for a while, get a little money, go off to Louisville for a while, and then it falls to Wheeler, his nephew, he'll get a call from the hotel, the Stag Hotel. Well, your uncle's here, you better come get him. He's out of money and he's in really bad shape. So Wheeler will go up there and get him and put him on the train and ride back there with him. The youngsters just adore him, but of course the parents don't want them to be like him as much as they would like to be. He's wonderful when he's sober. Hannah Coulter, this is the most amazing book I've ever read, work of fiction where an author writes about something that he couldn't possibly know from experience. And what I'm talking about is Hannah Coulter is a woman and Wendell Berry is a man. I have never read a book by a man about a woman, or for that matter, a woman about a man, that gets so convincingly, incredibly into the mindset of the character. It's just, to me, it's marvelous, made miraculous what he does here. Hannah Coulter, as you can see, loses her first husband. There's a very tenuous period in the novel where he's reported missing. And how long do we wait with the letter from the government saying he's missing until we conclude he's dead, which they eventually do. In fact, she's talking one time to his father, her father-in-law, and she's talking about, and they have a baby, they have a little daughter. Oh, won't Virgil be so thrilled when he comes home to see little Margaret? And Virgil's father blows up at her and tells her, "You're going to have to stop talking about that. He's dead." And she grieves for 3 years and then remarries, has a couple of boys. Her grandson, Virgie, grows, comes of age in the 60s, gets involved with drugs, disappears for 5-10 years. They don't know where he is, but eventually he comes to his senses, like the prodigal son, shows back up. No criticism, no judgment, just get to work, boy, which is how they did things. There's a chapter in the book Hannah Coulter called Okinawa. And this is, again, Berry's treatise on pacifism, you could say, in fictional form. Okinawa was the last stop for the Pacific Theater War, and it was thought, okay, we'll use Okinawa as a basis for invading the mainland of Japan. And so it was a 3-month, very bloody war. Nathan Coulter does serve there. Unlike Virgil Faulkner, he does come back, but he won't talk about the war, won't talk about his experiences there. But the last bullet point shows you Berry's treatment of what happens to families and farms and farmland when war occurs. So it's a fictional part of his case for pacifism. Matt Faulkner, there's a marvelous story about him as an old man. He's really about to die, but he wants to go down, walk around his property to see whether a fence has been repaired by Nathan. And yes, it has been. But then he starts seeing these visions of people who are dead, people in the membership that he knew, hearing their voices. They're portrayed as real as they can be. And well, he thinks about, well, maybe I should just join him. He stumbles and falls down. He's an old man and he doesn't have his balance very well. But he wants to just lie down and die there, but he doesn't. He's still a member. He's got other people to think about. He has a very difficult climb. In fact, he doesn't make it all the way back up to his house. He collapses underneath a tree, which is right next to one of the little dirt roads, and just passes out there. And finally, some of his neighbors come along and see him there and take him back up. But there he is. And, a few months later in the book, he's dead. Elton and Mary Penn, 17 and 18. Her parents say, Elton, oh, he's just a nothing. He'll never amount to anything. And they cut him. The parents cut her off and him too. But he gets. He's got another family, the Port William membership, and they just embrace him and they do well. Very sad ending. Finally, after decades, their daughter gets a note from the grandmother who cut her parents off. she wants to try to make a connection, and the daughter never answers it. You made your decision, whoever you are, and you're going to have to live with it. Sad, but understandable, I guess. Burley Coulter, another great character who pops up in many of the stories. He's a lot of fun, has a long-term relationship with a woman, Kate Helen, and they have a son, Danny, who calls Burley Coulter Uncle Burley. Everybody knows he's the father, but that's how they do it. He does his job being a dad to Danny. And then right at the end, he's having a lot of health problems. He finally gets talked into going to the doctor. The doctor says, you need to go to the hospital right away. They take him to the hospital where they connect him up to all kinds of tubes and breathing machines, etc. And Danny, his son, slips in there, gets some kind of suit, gets some kind of garb on. Actually, he dresses up like an undertaker's assistant, gets in his father's room, disconnects all of the medical stuff, and puts him on a gurney, covers him up with a blanket, and encounters a nurse or something in the hallway who assumes the person under the blanket has died and the undertaker's coming to take the body. So he slips him out, and he puts him in the car, takes him out to the barn that he's worked in all his life, puts him on a stack of hay. Danny realizes Uncle Burley's about to die. Then he goes down and digs Uncle Burley's grave. And while Uncle Burley is up there and in the hay in the barn dying, comes back to check on him, holds his hand while he breathes his last, and then puts him in the ground, covers him up. Later, the disappearance from the hospital is investigated by a state trooper, and there's some comical scenes in there about how the family deflects the investigation and the trooper eventually gives up. Okay, Jack Beecham. This is just a sad story of a mismatch of a marriage. He's rough and passionate, but when he finally gets ready for marriage, he courts a woman from his church who wants to sanctify him. It reminds me of the old saying, a lot of difficulty and discord in marriage comes from the fact that she thinks he'll change and he doesn't. He thinks she'll always be the same and she doesn't. And so their first child is stillborn, a son. She is, I guess, what you could call a frigid woman. She just cringes when he touches her, just barely tolerates intercourse, and ends it after their second child, who does live. It's a daughter. No more. Do you understand? So he sleeps in a separate bedroom and takes a lover, then loses her in a house fire. And Berry says he gave his wife everything except what she really wanted, and she gives him everything except what he really wanted. So in every other respect, they were well matched. He also has quite a temper and gets ensnarled in a conflict with a neighbor about a land deal, and gets involved with a fight with him, and the neighbor, to take revenge, comes over one night and sets his barn on fire. So he's got to rebuild his barn, go deeper into debt. So it's a heartrending story about a man who had a lot to offer, but doesn't end up going well for him. So let me pause there again before we go into the criticism, and let's see, another 10 minutes or so maybe for the final slides, and then we can wrap it up. Any question, comment?
I was just wondering if you were to recommend a book, what would you say would be good for a first book read by him?
Yes, Hannah Coulter. The other one, let's see, what's it called? Andy Catlett is about one of the main characters. It starts out with him taking a trip as a little boy to a neighboring town. So Hannah Coulter or Andy Catlett. Yes, how about that?
I wrote it down.
Good. Anybody else? Okay, criticism. These are essays, and he says this is a title of one of his volumes of essays, an essay in the volume, and he explains in the preface, I'm really not trying to defend ignorance, although remember that Mad Farmer saw a poem that says, praise everything you can't understand, and ignorance is good because what we understand, we destroy. Anyway, but in this essay, he goes through about 6 or 7 different types of ignorance, and the worst kind of ignorance is what he calls arrogant ignorance. And it's pretty much the way that he sees the world going that has destroyed the way of life that he was born into and promotes in his fiction and everything else, his poetry. So there's this fascination with science so much. He's not against science, but he's against science being the be all and end all. Then what happens when science becomes the be all and end all? That people use technology based on science to create all kinds of problems, which you sometimes hear. You can solve the problems created by technology with technology, better technology. Well, combine that with greed, and he's extremely focused on how we're ruining the soil, and we're going to end up not having enough to eat because we've treated the soil so harshly with the practices of modern agribusiness. Anyway, all that adds up to what he calls arrogant ignorance. So this is what I'm talking about. You don't read him unless you want to get clobbered for all the ways in which the world has developed that we're all implicated in. His view of property, he thinks that what the agribiz and mining companies are doing against the land is equal to a foreign invasion, like Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor, something like that. And so just as we expect government to defend us from foreign invaders, thus government should defend us from domestic ones. But of course, the government officials are all in bed with agribusiness interests and the mining companies through campaign contributions and all kinds of other things. So it's a terrible thing about this country that the people, the government officials, are cozy with the very people that they need to be warring against, preventing us from being harmed by. He does not believe in absolute ownership of property. If I own this piece of land, for example, I can do with it whatever I want to. But he's also got a critique of, do you remember that book that came out in the 1970s connected with feminism called Our Bodies, Ourselves? And it was very much tied in with the promotion of, Roe v. Wade, the decision legalizing abortion or preventing states from banning it. We don't anymore own our bodies. Then the property owner who wants to strip mine it owns that property. It's both of those are good examples of what he calls deluded thinking. The key to all this is the final bullet. We think of the farmer owning the farm, but it's really the opposite. And we're stewards of what God has provided for us. Is the way he looks at property. It's really not as much of an absolute as we're accustomed to thinking of it. The Southern agrarians, he sometimes compared to them. I won't go into this very much, but they were literary figures who mostly around Vanderbilt University. And this was at a time in the 20s and 30s when the lost cause movement was pretty strong. Lost cause movement was coming back from being defeated by the Civil War. There were a lot of Southerners and Southern organizations that talked about how justifiable the Southern cause was and the valor of the Confederate soldiers. A lot of Confederate monuments erected then are now being taken down. Berry's comment about these so-called agrarians, very few of them actually were farmers. They were mostly professors, and they got out of the South and away from the agricultural land and the concerns as quickly as they could when they got teaching offers elsewhere. So he takes kind of a jaded view of them. By the way, Robert Penn Warren, who wrote All the King's Men, is also from Kentucky. Complexification is a word that he invented. It's the opposite of simplification. And he's a big admirer of Henry David Thoreau, who said, simplify, simplify, simplify. But he says, golly, it's much simpler for me to live in New York and get what I need from stores than it was to become a farmer. And general principles or theories are one of the main ways that we simplify our lives. A good theory or a principle can take a lot of concrete details and draw them together into a simple principle. Well, it's not like that when you're a farmer. Everything is its own particular fact or situation. This mule, this harness, this fence, etc. You can't transfer what you know from one situation to the next situation. It's all different. And that's why farming is so complex. I've never been a farmer, so I can kind of see what he's talking about. Okay, what about religious stuff? Uneasy reader of the Bible, man of faith and a renegade Christian. The Burden of the Gospels is an essay that says, yes, the gospel teachings are just totally burdensome. And some of the very just extremely difficult, if not impossible, teachings of Jesus. And how are we supposed to live up to those things? Well, some people, the third bullet, say, well, we don't really have to interpret them literally. We can, they're metaphors, or it's an idea to give you a principle maybe, but you don't really take it seriously, like pluck out your eye if it offends you, that sort of thing. But Berry recognizes levels of interpretation, but he says, well, with all those other levels, you still need to hold on to the literal meaning. They mean what they mean. And of course, it's a burden to have such mysterious stuff that you're supposed to be responsible for and live up to, and just treat it as a burden to be born. No, don't make it easy on yourself. Don't cast off the burden by making it all metaphorical or watering it down. Take it on, is what he says about religion, as Christianity in particular. Okay, what are we supposed to do? Some of his recommendations. The third bullet, husbandry and housewifery, are only somewhat gender specific in his writings, because there are a lot of husbands, if they don't have a wife or a family, they do the housework too. And a lot of the wives or the women work out in the fields. Political parties should forget about winning. And there have been some successful political people who did follow that. I think about, well, George Washington didn't want to be president. He accepted it when it was thrust upon him. Ulysses Grant didn't even attend the Republican nominating session that nominated him for president, and he didn't campaign. Well, whatever. If people want me, they'll vote me in. For corporations, playing the long game means sustainability, conserving the soil, looking beyond the quarterly profit report or the year's profit. Look to the future. We want our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to have what we're able to enjoy. Don't use it all up and spoil it. This is a little local note. I read an article in local news. The Bowling Green schools are supposed to have some kind of farm to school program with their cafeteria service, 20% of the budget. The purple cauliflower story is about a food service director at one of our schools here in Bowling Green. She got a call from a farmer who said, well, I've got a batch of purple cauliflower that I want to bring over to your school so you can serve it to the kids. Well, it was enough to, she didn't have cauliflower on the menu that day or that week, but okay, let's make this work. But the amount of purple cauliflower that showed up was only enough to feed about 1/3 of the student. So then she had to go back out to the usual sources to get enough cauliflower that wasn't purple to feed the rest of the students. So she gets an A for effort and trying to make it work. But it's a Wendell Berry type idea, and it's just kind of amusing to me to see some of the challenges of implementing it. The Green Revolution is what he's so much against, but it deserves at least a look at what we have gotten from it in the 50s and 60s, when all the good stuff, according to Berry, in agriculture started to go away. And let's give you this one fact. In 1960, 1961, India was on the brink of starvation, mass starvation in India. However, these agricultural innovations really took hold. Rockefeller Ford Foundations helped in India and other countries. The main figure, Norman Borlaug, winner of the Peace Prize, was credited for saving the lives of 1 billion people who otherwise would have died of starvation. Now, for some people who are focused on sustainability, I hate to say this, but 1 billion more people on the world surface is not necessarily a good idea. Overpopulation is a big concern from ecological and sustainability issues. However, this is some of the stuff that gets accomplished by doing agriculture just the opposite way that Wendell Berry wants us to do it. Final slide, just a kind of a summation. What is he against? What is he for? Kind of speaks for itself. I will comment on rationality. Of course, he wants us to use our mind, but rationality in two meanings that he's against are, first of all, in economics, in the science of economics, rationality means self-interest. The rational agent in an economy, one looking out for number one. Berry thinks that's wrong. Rationality also refers to the worship of science, or the view of science being the be-all and end-all, the only thing we have to pay attention to. Imagination, by contrast, is not just making up stuff. He defines it as making real for ourselves, causing to be real in our mind what really does matter. And in last two, he's in favor of many restrictions on personal liberty, that he thinks are necessary and feels go along with what he's for, namely loving others rather than engaging in all the greed and destruction of the earth that he sees around him. So that's it for me, and thank you very much for participating, and be glad to hear any final comments.
This was
Well,
great.
get a
Thank
follow-
you so much.
You're welcome.
When was he born and lived to, Olin?
Well, he was born in 1934, so he's now 88 and still kicking,
No.
I guess.
All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Olin, you kind of got to this in your presentation, but one of the things I really like about Berry is that he seems to be hated and liked by people both in the left and the right.
Yeah.
And he shows up in publications on the left and the right. And I
Yeah.
find that's true of very few authors these days. And I think it's interesting and makes him worth paying attention to. What do you think about that?
Yes, I agree. There's you think about the cultural wars, and you couldn't find a more pro-family writer than Wendell Berry. And so to conservatives, that's music to their ears. He's very much, he says, I'm very much against abortion as a method of birth control. And so again, that would be a conservative position, but the conservatives also in our country generally support free enterprise. And Berry says it's been way too free and caused way too much destruction. So that's a turnoff for the conservatives, something that by contrast or conversely, the liberals would adore him because they're more associated with conservation, protection of the earth and ecology and so on. But there are other parts. I mean, he's not pro-choice when it comes to abortion. So there's something to, I think, from both extremes. There's something to like and something not to like in Berry. Was that your point?
Yeah, it just seems like he's a more independent thinker. It seems like,
Anyway, that's what I heard from you, and I do agree with it. Yes. And he's not a centrist in a way that compromises both sides. It's like it's almost like he's on the extreme both ways in different areas.
and as you suggested, he's a kind of equal opportunity scolder. No matter where you are, if you read him, you'll get scolded.
Yeah, don't read him unless you're ready to be clobbered. Well, thank you, Peter.
Olin, there was one comment in the chat, which was from Greg Winter saying
Oh, yeah.
he needed to join another call at 3:00. And he said, nice work, Olin.
Okay, well, good.
Are there other comments or questions? Well, Olin, thank you very much.
I was dying to ask one more if there's time.
Sure.
Olin, do you think Berry's greater as a poet, essayist, or novelist, or fiction writer, I guess, short story novel? Because
That's a hard one, but I'm going to answer fiction writer. I enjoy his fiction more than the other two genres, but again, going back to the name escapes me, but who's, let's see, I referred to him already. Who's the author of all the King's Men?
Warren.
Yeah, Robert Penn Warren. I think Warren has won Pulitzer Prizes in 2 of those genres, maybe all 3, but he's kind of like Berry in having excelled at all 3. How about you? Which which genre do you like Berry best?
I'm
for?
with you. I'm with you. When I
Yeah.
read the fiction, I'm completely in that world. And he's
Yeah.
a great essayist and a great poet. But when I read the fiction, I feel like I'm really entering the world of Wendell Berry fully.
Yes, indeed. Okay, well, we're like-minded, and maybe we can get into this more this summer out in the woods with or on the rivers with Leaf.
Sorry, I totally blew the time zone thing, Olin. I have it in my
Oh.
I read it the opposite way. It's my fault. So
Okay, here's our friend
late.
Leaf.
I'm coming in late, but
Yeah.
it's good. It's good to see my
Uh,
friend Pete, and good to see you, Olin, and to get a little bit of Berry. And I think this is being recorded, huh?
It is being recorded, yes.
Oh, great.
So does it go out on YouTube or something? Eventually?
Yes, it's on the Association of Lifelong Learners YouTube channel, and you can access that through the Association of Lifelong Learners.org webpage. It's very obvious how to connect to the YouTube channel, and just find it there.
Very good.
Olin, once again, thank you very much, and have a great
You're welcome.
afternoon, everybody.
My
Hi,
pleasure.
Dennis Stobeck, by the way, political science teacher. I remember there. This is Brian Grahusky.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Olin. Yeah, I do. All right.
Well,
to
are you
see you.
saying, Brian, that Mark was your political science teacher?
Dennis Stobeck
Dennis.
was.
Okay. Yes. All right. Yeah. Well, it's wonderful the way that people are brought together with these programs. It's like old home week for me too.
Wonderful, except for the time zone differences. I mean, I work with several groups where time zone really does impact.
Well, it's a blessing and a curse that we get in touch with each other, see each other these ways, but gotta love it. Okay, well, it's wonderful to have this opportunity, and thanks so much, Mark, to you for setting it up.
Glad to do it.
Bye-bye,
Thanks, Olin.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody.